The Thompson family's quiet camping trip was about to turn into a once-in-a-lifetime rescue when they spotted a tiny bobcat kitten appear, darting out from the bushes. The animal wasn't just hungry, it was desperate. After they gave it food, the kitten did something unbelievable. It refused to leave. Instead, it cried out and insisted they follow it into the dense wilderness. They had no idea that following this crying kitten would lead them to the edge of a deadly cliff. And that's when they heard it. Another cry, weaker but unmistakable, coming from 20 feet below on a narrow ledge. A frantic mother bobcat was staying nearby, desperate. But the way this wild mother bobcat would later thank them would change their lives forever. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning sun cast long shadows through the ponderosa pines of Arizona's Prescott National Forest, painting the rocky terrain in shades of gold and amber. The Thompson family had chosen this particular clearing for their weekend camping trip, drawn by the promise of solitude and the whisper of wind through ancient trees. John Thompson, a construction foreman from Phoenix, had been promising his wife Alice this getaway for months. Their teenage children, Mark and Sarah, had reluctantly agreed to leave their phones in the car, though they'd grumbled about it during the entire 3-hour drive north. The clearing sat perfectly positioned between towering granite formations and a dense stand of juniper trees. John had just finished setting up their blue dome tent when Alice called out from near their makeshift kitchen area. She'd spread a checkered tablecloth over a flat boulder and was arranging sandwiches for lunch. The turkey she'd roasted the night before filled the air with a savory aroma that competed with the sharp scent of pine sap and desert sage. "Dad, look!" Sarah's voice cut through the peaceful morning air. She stood frozen near the edge of their campsite, pointing toward a cluster of manzanita bushes. A tiny creature emerged from the reddish bark and twisted branches. A bobcat kitten, no more than 8 weeks old, its spotted coat dusty and matted with burrs. The kitten moved with an unusual urgency, not the typical wariness wild animals showed around humans. Its amber eyes were wide with what Alice immediately recognized as distress. As a veterinary technician before having children, she'd seen that look in countless animals brought to the clinic. This wasn't curiosity or hunger. This was desperation. "Nobody move," John whispered, though the kitten seemed entirely focused on something beyond mere survival. It approached their picnic area with purposeful steps, its tiny paws making no sound on the sandy soil. When it reached the boulder where their lunch waited, it let out a cry that was part mew, part wail, a sound that made Alice's heart constrict. Without thinking, Alice tore off small pieces of turkey from their sandwiches. She placed them on the ground, backing away slowly. The kitten approached cautiously at first, then devoured the meat with fierce intensity. Between bites, it would pause and look directly at the family, particularly at Alice, as if trying to communicate something urgent. Mark, usually absorbed in his own world, watched with genuine fascination. "Mom, something's wrong. Look how it keeps looking back at the trees." When the kitten finished eating, it didn't flee as they expected. Instead, it took several steps toward the forest, stopped, and looked back at them. The message was unmistakable. "Follow me." "We shouldn't interfere with wildlife," John said, though his voice lacked conviction. The kitten cried again, more insistently this time, and took another few steps before looking back. "John," Alice said softly, "I think it needs help." Against his better judgment, John nodded. "Sarah, Mark, stay close. We'll just see what's happening." The family followed the kitten along a narrow game trail that wound between massive boulders and thorny ocotillo plants. The path grew steeper, and the morning sun climbed higher, intensifying the desert heat. The kitten moved with surprising speed for such a small creature, occasionally stopping to ensure they were still following. After nearly 15 minutes of hiking, the trail opened onto a dramatic vista. A sheer cliff face dropped away to their left, while jagged rocks formed a natural barrier to their right. The kitten ran to the cliff edge and began crying frantically, its small voice echoing off the canyon walls. That's when they heard it. Another cry, weaker but unmistakably similar, coming from below. John dropped to his stomach and crawled to the edge, peering over carefully. About 20 feet down, on a narrow ledge no wider than a doormat, another bobcat kitten clung precariously to the rock face. Its back leg appeared to be wedged into a crack in the granite, and every attempt to free itself only seemed to worsen its predicament. Above them, on a higher outcropping accessible only by an impossibly narrow traverse, an adult bobcat paced frantically. The mother. Her powerful body coiled with tension as she tested various approaches to reach her trapped baby, but the cliff face offered no safe route. Her amber eyes locked onto John's for a moment, and in them, he saw something that transcended the boundary between human and animal. Pure maternal anguish. "Oh, God," Alice breathed, her hand covering her mouth. The baby's stuck. The trapped kitten's cries grew more desperate. Its free paws scrambled against the smooth rock, finding no purchase. Each movement threatened to dislodge it entirely from the narrow ledge. If it fell from that height onto the jagged rocks below, survival was unlikely. John studied the cliff face with the eye of someone who'd spent years working on construction sites. The rock was mostly smooth granite with few handholds. They had brought basic camping supplies, including a 30-foot rope in their backpack, but no climbing gear. The nearest ranger station was at least an hour away, and by then, "I'm going down," John announced, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "John, no!" Alice grabbed his arm. "That's insane. You're not a climber. We should call for help." "There's no time. Look at it. That kitten's exhausted. It won't last until help arrives." Mark, usually eager to challenge his father's decisions, remained silent. He could see the determination in his father's eyes, the same look he'd seen when his dad had pulled a neighbor's child from their pool the previous summer. John emptied his pockets, removed his hiking boots for better grip, and tied one end of the rope around his waist. "Mark, Sarah, I need you both to anchor this rope around that pine tree, Alice. You guide me verbally if you see a better route." The first few feet were manageable. John found small crevices for his fingers and tiny ledges for his toes. But as he descended, the rock face became increasingly smooth and treacherous. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not entirely from the morning heat. His construction experience had taught him about safety margins and calculated risks, and right now, he was operating well outside any reasonable margin. 10 feet down, his left foot slipped. For a heart-stopping moment, he hung by his fingertips alone, his body swinging out from the cliff face. Sarah screamed. The mother bobcat stopped pacing and watched intently. "You've got this," Alice called down, her voice remarkably calm despite her terror. "There's a small ledge to your right, about 6 inches. John found the ledge and continued his descent. His forearms burned, and his fingers began to cramp. The rope offered psychological comfort more than actual safety. If he fell, it might prevent a fatal plunge, but not serious injury. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, John's feet touched the narrow ledge where the kitten waited. The tiny creature pressed itself against the back wall, eyes wide with fear. Its trapped leg was wedged deeply into a diagonal crack, and John could see it was swollen from the kitten's struggles. "Hey there, little one," John spoke softly, the same tone he'd used when his children were babies and frightened by thunderstorms. "I'm here to help." Moving with infinite patience, John examined the trapped leg. The crack narrowed at an angle that prevented the kitten from simply pulling free. He would need to rotate the leg slightly while lifting it, a delicate operation that required the kitten's cooperation. Above, the mother bobcat had moved to a closer vantage point. John could feel her intense gaze as he worked. One wrong move, one sign of harm to her baby, and he had no doubt she would find a way to reach him. Consequences be damned. With movements as gentle as he could manage while balancing on the precarious ledge, John placed one hand on the kitten's body to steady it. The tiny creature trembled but didn't struggle. Perhaps it sensed his intent, or perhaps it was simply too exhausted to fight. "Okay, little one, this might hurt for just a second," John murmured. He carefully rotated the trapped leg while applying gentle upward pressure. The kitten cried out once, sharp and piercing, causing the mother above to release a low growl that raised the hair on John's neck. But then, freedom. The leg slipped free from its granite prison. John quickly examined the leg. Swollen and scraped, but no obvious breaks. The kitten immediately tried to stand but wobbled dangerously close to the edge. John caught it, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The tiny wildcat, instead of struggling or trying to bite, pressed its small head against John's chest. He could feel its rapid heartbeat against his palm, feel the trust this wild creature had placed in him. "Now comes the hard part," John said to himself. He fashioned a crude sling from the rope, creating a pouch against his chest where he could secure the kitten. The climb up would require both hands, and he couldn't risk dropping the injured baby. The ascent was a nightmare of endurance and willpower. Every handhold was a victory, every foot of progress a testament to determination. The kitten remained still against his chest, as if understanding that their survival depended on cooperation. John's muscles screamed, his fingers bled from the rough granite, but he climbed. 3 feet from the top, his strength finally gave out. His fingers began to uncurl from their holds, his legs shaking uncontrollably. This was it, the moment when physics and exhaustion would claim victory. Then Mark's face appeared above him, followed by Sarah's. His children, working together without argument for perhaps the first time in years, reached down and grabbed his arms. Alice anchored them from behind, and together, they hauled John and his precious cargo over the edge to safety. John collapsed on solid ground, his chest heaving. Carefully, he extracted the kitten from the makeshift sling. Its sibling immediately ran over, and the two began grooming each other, their tiny pink tongues working to remove the dust and fear of separation. The mother bobcat descended from her perch with liquid grace, using routes invisible to human eyes. She approached her babies with a mixture of urgency and caution, aware of the human family watching. When she reached them, the reunion was something from a nature documentary, pure emotion transcending species. She examined every inch of her injured kitten, her rough tongue gentle as she cleaned its wounded leg. The Thompson family sat in exhausted silence, witnesses to something profound. Alice found herself crying, the stress and relief overwhelming her normally composed demeanor. She reached for her backpack to get her water bottle, only to realize she'd left it back at the clearing in their rush to follow the kitten. That's when the mother bobcat did something that would remain etched in their memories forever. She picked up Alice's backpack in her powerful jaws, not aggressively, but with deliberate care. She carried it to where Alice sat and placed it gently beside her, then stepped back. The message was unmistakable. "Thank you." Alice's hands trembled as she opened her pack and took a long drink from her water bottle. John, despite his exhaustion, couldn't help but laugh, a release of tension that spread to the whole family. They sat there in the morning sun, two species sharing a moment of perfect understanding. The bobcat family didn't immediately leave. The mother allowed her injured kitten to rest, occasionally glancing at the humans with what could only be described as gratitude. The uninjured kitten, emboldened by the peaceful atmosphere, actually approached John and rubbed against his leg before scampering back to its mother. After nearly an hour, when the injured kitten seemed steady enough to travel, the mother bobcat gathered her babies. She began leading them into the deeper forest, but at the tree line, she paused. She turned back to look at the Thompson family one last time, her golden eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. Then she and her kittens melted into the shadows of the pines, returning to their wild world. The Thompsons hiked back to their campsite in contemplative silence. Mark helped his father, whose arms were too exhausted to carry the backpack. Sarah stayed close to her mother, occasionally reaching out to take her hand. They packed up their camp that afternoon, the weekend trip cut short by the morning's events, but none of them minded. They had experienced something far more valuable than a routine camping trip. On the drive home, as the desert gave way to the urban sprawl of Phoenix, they talked about what had happened. Mark, usually glued to his phone, hadn't even thought to document the encounter. Sarah, typically focused on her social media presence, hadn't taken a single photo. They had been entirely present in the moment, and that in itself was a gift. John's hands, bandaged by Alice with supplies from the car's first aid kit, would heal within weeks. The scratches and bruises would fade. But the memory of that tiny heartbeat against his chest, the trust of a wild creature in its moment of desperate need, would remain vivid. The story became family legend, told at gatherings and holidays. Friends and extended family sometimes expressed skepticism about the mother bobcat's gesture with the backpack, but the Thompsons didn't mind. They knew what they had experienced. They had been given a glimpse into the secret world that exists parallel to our own, where the boundaries between human and animal blur in moments of crisis and compassion. 3 years later, John's company landed a contract to build custom homes in the Prescott area. He convinced Alice to join him for a site visit, and they decided to revisit the trail where their encounter had taken place. They didn't expect to see anything. Wildlife rarely provides such encore performances. But as they sat on a familiar boulder eating lunch, movement in the manzanita caught their eye. A bobcat emerged, fully grown and healthy, with distinctive markings they both recognized. Behind her followed 3 kittens, tiny and curious, exploring their world with wonder. The adult bobcat saw them and paused. For just a moment, those golden eyes held recognition. She didn't approach, maintaining the proper boundary between wild and domestic, but she didn't flee either. One of her kittens had a slight limp in its back leg, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. Alice grabbed John's hand, squeezing it tight. They watched as the bobcat family moved through the clearing, the mother occasionally glancing back at them with what they chose to interpret as acknowledgement. When the cats disappeared into the forest, Alice and John sat in comfortable silence, their hands still intertwined. The sun painted the rocks gold, just as it had 3 years before. Some connections, they realized, transcend the moment of their making. Some acts of compassion create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate impact. They returned to Phoenix that evening with renewed purpose. John began volunteering with local wildlife rehabilitation centers, using his construction skills to build better enclosures. Alice returned to veterinary work, specializing in wildlife care. Mark, inspired by that day on the cliff, had changed his major to conservation biology. Sarah started a nonprofit focused on educating people about coexisting with wildlife. The Bobcat family had given them more than just a memorable encounter. They had provided a reminder of what matters: the willingness to help despite personal risk, the universal nature of parental love, and the profound connections possible between species when fear gives way to trust. Every time John looked at the thin scars on his palms, he remembered the weight of that kitten against his chest. Every time Alice heard a cat's cry, she remembered the urgency in that first kitten's call for help. They had been changed by their encounter, made better by their willingness to answer nature's call for compassion. The Prescott Forest continued its ancient rhythms: predator and prey, life and death, survival and loss. But within that harsh reality, there existed moments of grace, opportunities for different species to recognize their shared vulnerability and capacity for kindness. The Thompson family had been privileged to experience such a moment, and they carried it forward, a bright light in an often challenging world. In the end, the measure of their adventure wasn't in the risk John took climbing down that cliff, though that was remarkable. It wasn't in the mother bobcat's gesture of thanks, though that was extraordinary. It was in how a single morning's events had redirected 4 human lives toward a greater purpose. How a cry for help from a tiny wildcat had awakened something fundamental in a family that had been drifting apart in the mundane routines of modern life. The Bobcats remained in their wild world, and the Thompsons in theirs. But the boundary between those worlds had proven more permeable than any of them had imagined. In moments of need, in acts of compassion, in the recognition of shared experience across species, that boundary could dissolve entirely, revealing the deeper truth that all life is connected. All suffering matters, and all acts of kindness create ripples that extend far beyond their origin.